The river was black as sin when Perry Redmond drove his horse into it. The cold water rose to his stirrups, then his knees, then the horse's chest, and still he pushed forward through the current, through the darkness, through the kind of fear that a man who had faced cattle stampedes and droughts and creditors with loaded pistols had never quite felt before. This fear was different. This fear had a name. It had brown eyes and a voice like a prairie morning, and it was sitting in a house on the other side of this river right now, maybe packing a trunk, maybe signing a paper, maybe deciding once, and for all that Perry Redmond had waited too long and said too little and deserved every consequence of his silence. He had found out an hour ago. 1 hour. Tom Braddock had been in the general store when Perry walked in for feed supplies, and Tom had that look men get when they know something you don't and they're burning to tell it. He'd leaned on the counter and said it casual as weather talk. Said Anna Lawson had accepted Hector Gaines' proposal. Said the preacher was coming through Millhaven on Friday. Said everybody in town already knew but Perry, which seemed about right because Perry had a talent for being the last man informed of the things that mattered most to him. He hadn't bought the feed. He'd walked straight back out into the October dusk, stood in the dust of Main Street for 30 seconds while the information rearranged his entire understanding of his own life, and then he'd mounted up and ridden hard toward the river. He hadn't planned what he would say. He hadn't planned anything. The only thought in his head was a sentence so simple and so late and so crushing that it had been living behind his teeth for nearly 2 years, waiting for a moment of courage he kept postponing. He needed to say it. He needed to say it to Anna Lawson's face before Friday came and took the possibility away from him forever. The horse surged up the opposite bank, water sheeting off his flanks, hooves finding purchase in the dark mud. Perry didn't slow down. The Lawson homestead was a quarter-mile through a stand of cottonwood trees, and there was a single lamp burning in the front window like a small yellow star, and he rode toward it the way a drowning man swims toward a thrown rope, with everything he had, with nothing held back. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground hard, and he crossed the porch in 3 strides and knocked on the door with his fist so hard the frame rattled. There was silence, then footsteps. Then the door opened. Anna Lawson stood in the lamplight with flour on her apron and her dark hair pinned loosely and her brown eyes going wide with shock. And Perry Redmond, who had never in his 31 years of living struggled to find words because words had always come easy to him, could not for one full terrible second produce a single syllable. She said, "Perry, you're soaking wet. What in the world?" "I should have said it sooner," he said. "Anna, I should have said it a long time ago." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Perry had ever heard. She stared at him. The lamp behind her flickered. Somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl called once and went quiet. Perry stood dripping river water onto her porch boards and waited for whatever came next, because whatever it was, he had earned it with 2 years of silence and cowardice dressed up as patience. Anna Lawson had come to Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1883, which was not so very long ago in calendar terms, but felt to Perry Redmond like another lifetime, before he understood what her presence in this particular valley was going to do to the architecture of everything he thought he knew about himself. She had come from Missouri, from a small town outside of Kansas City, on the back of grief. Her father, James Lawson, had been a dry goods merchant of modest success and enormous pride, and when he died of a fever in February of that year, he left behind a homestead claim in Callahan County, Texas, that he had filed 2 years prior with the intention of eventually moving the family west. The family was Anna and her younger sister Nora, who was 17 and full of opinions, and the claim was 160 acres of grassland along the Pecan Branch Creek, which was not the most impressive water source in Texas, but was better than nothing and better than a lot of what folks were working with out there on the frontier. Perry's ranch, the Redmond Double R, sat adjacent to the Lawson claim on its northern border. He had built it over 6 years from a single purchase section into something that approached real prosperity: 400 head of cattle, a good bunkhouse, a stone and timber main house that his mother had said looked almost civilized when she visited from San Antonio. He was 30 years old when the Lawson women arrived, old enough to have buried a father and a business partner and a friend taken by cholera, old enough to have learned that the land did not care about your plans or your feelings, old enough to know himself reasonably well. He had not been prepared for Anna. He met her on her second day in Millhaven, which was also the day she walked into the land office to present her father's claim papers, and discovered that a man named Silas Prout had filed a competing claim on 30 of her father's acres, specifically the 30 that included the best water access on the property. Silas Prout was not a farmer. He was a land speculator who worked in concert with a cattle operation out of Abilene, and he had a lawyer who wore a suit coat in 90-degree heat and spoke in complete paragraphs, and Anna Lawson had no lawyer at all. Perry had been in the land office for his own business when it happened. He watched the man in the suit coat present his papers with smooth professional condescension, watched the land office clerk look increasingly uncomfortable, watched Anna's face go through several rapid transformations, fear to anger to something harder and more controlled than either. She was not a tall woman, but she stood very straight, and when the suit coat man finished talking, she said, quietly and precisely, that her father had filed his claim in October of 1881, and if Mr. Prout's competing claim was filed in 1882, then the prior rights law was clear, and she would like the clerk to pull both original filing dates before anyone made any decisions about anything. The clerk pulled them. The dates confirmed what Anna had said. The suit coat man's expression flickered for one moment before returning to professional blankness, and he gathered his papers and left without speaking again. Perry introduced himself when she turned from the counter. She shook his hand firmly, like a woman who had been running a household alone for 8 months and had no patience for anything less than directness. She said her name. She said she was glad the filing dates had been what they were. He said he owned the ranch to the north of her property, and that if she needed anything in the way of local knowledge, he was available. He said it in the tone of a neighbor being helpful. He told himself it was nothing more than that. It was not nothing more than that. He knew it within a week. He kept finding reasons to ride past the Lawson property, kept discovering practical matters to discuss with his new neighbor, water rights and fence lines, and the general disposition of the local cattle population. Anna met each visit with the same direct courtesy, offered coffee when she had it, discussed the practical matters with intelligence and without pretense, and then got back to work because work on a frontier homestead was endless, and she understood that about her life completely. By summer, he had stopped pretending the visits were about practical matters. He simply came when he could, and she seemed to expect him, and there was a comfort in it that he had not experienced before with anyone, a sense that the conversation could stop and start without losing its thread. That silence between them was not awkward but simply a rest between words. Nora, Anna's younger sister, watched all of this with 17-year-old clarity and once said to her sister, in Perry's hearing distance while they were all working on a fence repair together, that some people could just say what they meant and save everyone a great deal of time. Anna had told Nora to mind her own business, and Perry had found a fence post that urgently required his full attention. The summer of 1883 burned hot and moved slow, and Perry spent it in a state of feeling that he could not quite bring himself to name. He told himself the hesitation was practical. He had a ranch to run. She had a homestead to establish. Neither of them had time for romantic complication. He told himself other things too, darker things, things rooted in a history he did not discuss freely. 3 years before Anna arrived, Perry had been engaged to a woman named Clara Voss, a banker's daughter from Abilene who had spent 4 months in Millhaven, before deciding that frontier life was not compatible with her understanding of what a life should look like. She had returned to Abilene, and 3 months after that he had heard, she married a railroad man. The engagement ending had not destroyed Perry Redmond. He was not that fragile, but it had deposited a particular wariness in him regarding the distance between what a person said and what a person meant, regarding the ways that hope could be extended and then withdrawn without warning, regarding the cost of opening a feeling and finding it unsupported. He told himself this history made him cautious. He told himself caution was wisdom. What it actually was, as he would come to understand standing soaking wet on Anna Lawson's porch in October of 1884, was fear. The autumn of 1883 brought its own complications. A drought that had been threatening all summer finally committed, and the pecan branch dropped to a trickle, and suddenly the 30 acres that Silas Prude had tried to claim became important again. Not legally this time. The water that accessed those acres fed a secondary channel that the Lawson homestead depended on. When the main creek dropped, that channel was the difference between Anna's small cattle herd having water and not having it. Perry extended his own water access to her herd as a matter of course, the kind of practical arrangement neighbors made, and said nothing about it being anything other than practical. He told himself he would have done it for any neighbor. He would have, but not quite in the same way, not with the same constancy of attention, not with the same internal vigilance toward her well-being that had by then become a permanent feature of his daily thinking. The drought broke in November, and the winter of 1883 was hard but not catastrophic. Perry helped Anna and Nora lay up wood and repair the roof of their small house before the first northers hit. He taught Nora how to read a weather sky because the girl had asked, and he found he enjoyed teaching her. He ate supper at the Lawson table more times than he could count, and felt something in those evenings that he had no honest name for except right. It felt right. The three of them around a table in a lamplit house, with the wind outside and beef stew in the bowls and conversation that ranged from the practical to the philosophical to the occasionally hilarious, and he would ride home afterward through the dark feeling full in a way that food alone had never managed. Spring came and the homestead began to show signs of real viability. Anna had planted a kitchen garden and was expanding it. She had struck a deal with the Millhaven General Store to supply eggs, and had acquired a small flock of chickens with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Nora had started attending the small school that a Methodist circuit teacher ran twice a week in the back of the church, and was reading novels with great enthusiasm and talking about them to anyone who would listen. Perry's ranch had a good season. He sold well at the Abilene market, and the Double R expanded to 500 head. He hired 2 additional hands, brothers from Tennessee named Cal and Owen Marsh, who were reliable and hardworking, and added to the particular life of the place. Things were good. Perry had every external reason to feel settled, and he did not feel settled. He felt like a man who had parked himself at the edge of something significant and could not make himself move forward. He had reasons, and he knew they were not good reasons. He told himself Anna had not given him any indication of interest beyond the warmth of friendship. But he knew, with the honesty that comes at 3 in the morning when you cannot sleep, that he had not given her much to respond to. He was present but not declared. He was attentive but not explicit. He brought the warmth of his company and none of the risk of his heart, and he told himself this was fair, and knew it was not. What he did not know, because Anna Lawson kept her own counsel in the manner of someone who had learned that displaying feeling without a clear indication it would be met carried its own dangers, was that she had been waiting, not passively, not helplessly, but waiting in the way that a woman of sense waits when she respects a man enough to let him arrive at himself without being pushed. She had not arrived in Millhaven expecting anything from Perry Redmond. She had arrived expecting hard work and loneliness, and the slow building of something that might sustain her and her sister. She had not expected to find a neighbor whose company made the hard work feel like less of a burden, whose conversation engaged her in ways she had not experienced since her father died, whose steadiness under difficulty made her feel, for the first time since she became the head of her own small household, that she was not entirely alone in a hard world. She let herself feel it carefully. She did not build assumptions. She watched him come and go through the seasons and read what she could read and waited for what he might offer. And when no explicit offer came, she held onto the warmth of what there was between them without letting herself grieve too loudly over what it might not be. This careful holding became harder in the summer of 1884 when Hector Gaines arrived. Hector Gaines was 38 years old, a widower of 4 years, and the owner of a prosperous ranch 20 miles south of Millhaven called the Gaines Crossing. He was well regarded. He had a good reputation, paid his debts, treated his hands fairly, and had raised 2 sons largely on his own after his wife Rachel died of childbed fever. The boys were 8 and 10 now and reportedly decent children. He was not an exciting man in the conventional sense, but he was a solid one, and he had made no secret since arriving in Millhaven for a cattle sale in June that he was interested in Anna Lawson. He was direct about it in a way that Perry had never been. He came to call with his hat in his hands, and his intention stated plainly. He brought small appropriate gifts, a sack of sugar when prices were high, a book of poetry that he said his late wife had enjoyed. He spoke to Anna about his sons and his property with an openness that invited her to evaluate him honestly. He was, by any objective measure, exactly the kind of man a woman building a frontier life alone should take seriously. Anna took him seriously. She was not indifferent to his attentions. He offered stability, partnership, a ready-made family, a chance to stop carrying everything alone. She was 26 years old and had been carrying everything alone for 18 months, and she was not too proud to recognize the weight of it. But she kept finding that when she tried to feel about Hector Gaines the way she felt about Perry Redmond, the arithmetic simply did not work. She could respect Hector. She could imagine a life with him that would be comfortable and purposeful. She could not imagine it with the particular quality of aliveness that she felt on an ordinary Tuesday when Perry came by to check the south fence line, and ended up staying for 3 hours talking about everything and nothing, and then rode away leaving her feeling more herself than she had before he arrived. She did not tell Perry about Hector's courtship in any direct way. She told herself this was because it was her own business, and she did not owe Perry an account of it. In her more honest moments, she admitted that she was waiting to see if the knowledge would reach him and what he would do with it. The knowledge reached Millhaven's general social awareness soon enough. Small towns in Texas in 1884 were not places where courtships remained private for long. Perry heard various references to Hector Gaines' visits to the Lawson homestead from various people over the summer, and received each one with a face that he believed communicated nothing, and that actually communicated quite a lot to anyone paying attention. What he did not do, through all of June and July and August and September, was say anything. He continued to visit. He continued to be exactly as present and warm and useful as he had always been. He continued to help with fence repairs and water management, and the 100 small practicalities of neighboring. He watched Hector Gaines drive up to the Lawson house in a clean wagon and felt something that scorched the inside of his chest and said nothing about it. Anna watched him say nothing and felt something harden slowly in the region of her own resolve. By September, she had told Hector she needed more time to think. She was not sure what she was thinking toward, only that she was not finished with the thinking. Hector had received this with patience and said he would wait as long as was reasonable, and she had thanked him and felt guilty about the degree to which his patience failed to move her. October arrived with its cold fronts and its urgency. The cattle market in Abilene was happening, and Perry was gone for 9 days driving his herd north, and in those 9 days Anna sat with the reality of her situation with unusual clarity. She was 26 years old. She had a 160-acre homestead, and a small herd, and a sister who would be making her own life eventually. And she had been conducting herself for 18 months as though time was not a factor in things when in fact time was the primary factor in everything. She made her decision on a Wednesday in the second week of October. She sent word to Hector Gaines that she would accept his proposal. The preacher, Reverend Macomb, was scheduled to pass through Millhaven on his circuit on Friday the 17th. She would speak to him then. She told herself she was being sensible. She told herself feeling would come with time and commitment, and that was true. She had known it to be true in other contexts. She told herself Perry Redmond had had every opportunity in the world and had made his position clear through silence, and that she had spent enough of herself on the hoping of it. She told herself these things and she believed them, and she was miserable with a particular quality of misery that she did not examine too closely, because examining it closely would have required her to admit how much it cost her. Tom Braddock was in the general store when Perry returned from Abilene on Thursday evening. The rest of that part of the story has already been told, and here they were, Perry dripping on her porch, Anna holding the door open with flour on her apron, and a question in her eyes that was more complicated than any question he had ever been asked. He said it again, because he needed to say it, needed to hear himself say it out loud so there would be no possibility later of telling himself he had been unclear. I should have said it sooner. That's not an excuse. I'm not here to explain why I didn't. I'm here because I could not come. I'm here because you're going to marry a good man on Friday who is not me, and I could not let that happen without telling you that I am in love with you, Anna. I have been in love with you for a long time. I'm sorry I took so long to say it. The owl in the cottonwoods called again. The lamp flame moved. Anna Lawson said nothing for what felt to Perry like the length of a geological era. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in before you catch your death." He came in. The house was warm. A fire was going in the stone fireplace, and there was a pot of something on the iron stove and a half-kneaded loaf of bread on the table beside a bowl of flour. He stood in the middle of the small room and watched Anna close the door and stand with her back to it for a moment. She turned around. Her eyes were very bright. She said, "How did you cross the river?" "The ferry doesn't run after dark," he said. "I rode through it." She stared at him. "You crossed the pecan branch in the dark on horseback." "Yes, Perry. I needed to get here." She put one hand over her mouth, and he could not tell from her expression alone whether she was about to laugh or cry or both. He waited. He had used up all his bravery in the crossing and in the words, and now he was simply standing there in a puddle of river water on her clean floor, waiting to find out what happened next. She said, "You absolute impossible man." He said, "I know." "Do you know how long?" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "Do you know what I have been sitting with for months? Do you have any idea?" "I'm starting to," he said quietly. "You were there," she said. "You were there all the time, every week, every season. I watched you come through my gate, and I thought every single time, maybe this time he will say it. And you never did. And I thought I had read it wrong. I told myself I had read it wrong because why else would a man—" She stopped again. Her voice had gone unsteady, and she was not a woman who let her voice go unsteady easily, and that unsteadiness undid something in Perry that had been held very tightly for a very long time. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He stopped in front of her because she had not said yes to anything yet, and he was not a man who assumed outcomes. He said, "You did not read it wrong. You never read it wrong. I was afraid, and I let the fear make my decisions, and I am standing here telling you that was the worst thing I have ever done, and I would spend however long you'll give me making it right if you'll let me." The room was very quiet. Anna looked up at him. The brightness in her eyes had spilled over slightly, and she was not one bit happy about that, he could tell, but she was not looking away. She said, "What about Hector Gaines?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's your decision. I'm not here to take a decision away from you. I'm here so that when you make it, you have all the information." She said very softly, "You're very wet." "I'm very in love," he said. The two things coincided. The sound she made was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but something that lived precisely between them. And then she stepped forward and put her head against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her in the way he had wanted to hold her for so long that the actual reality of it seemed almost impossible, warm and real and smelling of flower and wood smoke. And he felt something in himself, a knot that he had not known was knotted. He stood there holding her for a long moment, and then she pulled back and looked up at him. "I have to send word to Hector," she said. "I know. Tonight." "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you don't have to do anything tonight. Let me dry off and eat whatever's in that pot because I haven't eaten since morning, and then we can figure out what comes next." She laughed at that, a real laugh, and went to the stove, and Perry sat down in the chair closest to the fire and started to feel his extremities return to normal temperature. Nora appeared from the back room about 10 minutes later, saw Perry sitting by the fire in clothes that were damp and disheveled, looked at her sister's face, and said, with the absolute satisfaction of someone who had been right about something for a very long time, "Well, finally." Anna told her to go back to bed. Nora went back to bed grinning. They ate together at the small kitchen table, beef stew and the bread that Anna finished baking while Perry thawed, and they talked for a long time, the way they always talked, but with something new in the room with them now, something that had been locked outside the door and had finally been let in. Perry told her about the fear. He told her about Clara Voss and the way that ending had deposited its particular scar on his willingness to extend himself. He did not offer it as an excuse. He offered it as the truth about him, the parts that were less than he would have wished, because she deserved to know all of it. Anna listened without interruption, which was one of her great gifts, the ability to listen without rushing a person toward a conclusion. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she understood better than he might think, that she had her own versions of those scars, that the way her father's death had required her to become responsible for everything very quickly had made her cautious about trusting anyone to share the weight of it, because if you trusted someone to share the weight and they left, the weight came back doubled. Perry said he understood that. She said, "I need you to know that I am not the kind of woman who needs saving. I have been managing my own affairs very well." "You have," he said. "That's one of the things that's part of it, Anna. I have never admired anything as much as the way you run this place." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not entirely read and then said, "All right, all right, all right, Perry, all right." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a while in the firelight, not needing to say very much at all. He rode home before dawn, crossing the river in the gray pre-light with a completely different experience of it than the crossing 2 hours earlier. The current the same, the cold the same, but the weight in his chest reversed from something crushing to something lifted. He came out on his own bank and stood his horse in the thin mist of early morning and felt the particular quality of a life that had changed direction, unmistakable and irrevocable and good. The next morning he rode into Millhaven and sent a telegram to Hector Gaines. He had told Anna he would do this if she asked him to. She had asked him to, said she would write a letter but that the telegram would reach Hector faster, and it was kinder to let him know sooner rather than later. Perry sent it plain and factual, said that there had been a development affecting the Lawson situation and that Anna would be writing to him directly. He did not elaborate. It was not his story to elaborate on. Hector Gaines' response arrived the following day, addressed to Anna. Perry was not there when it came, and Anna told him about it later, sitting on her porch in the afternoon sun. Hector had written with dignity and without bitterness. He said he appreciated her honesty and wished her well. He said he had sensed there was something unresolved in the situation from the beginning and that he hoped whatever it was would give her what she was looking for. It was a good letter, Anna said, from a good man, and she felt the weight of it properly without diminishing it or him. Perry said he was sorry it had come to that, for Hector's sake. Anna said that was one of the things about Perry Redmond that made it impossible to stay angry at him for being late. He said, "There are things about me that make it possible," she said. "One or two," He laughed. It was one of those laughs that come from a real place, unguarded and full, and Anna watched him laugh in the autumn afternoon and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as happiness, straightforward and unqualified. October moved toward November. The word went around Millhaven, as words do in small towns, and was received variously. Most people seemed to find it romantic in a general way. Martha Henson at the general store said she had seen it coming since last winter and could not understand what had taken so long. Reverend Macomb, who had passed through as scheduled and found himself without a wedding to perform, said he hoped to make the acquaintance of the situation on his next circuit through. Tom Braddock, whose casual remark in the store had started the whole chain of events, considered himself responsible for a positive outcome and accepted congratulations with good humor. Cal and Owen Marsh, Perry's ranch hands, expressed their satisfaction in the way men of few words express most things, which was a brief nod and a return to work with a slightly improved quality of whistling. The courtship, as it now properly was, had a different texture than the long months before. There was less managing of distance, less careful calibration of what could be said and what could not. Perry came to the Lawson homestead without manufacturing reasons for it. Anna did not pretend the visits were purely neighborly. They rode together in the evening sometimes, out to the open grassland where the sky went enormous, and the cattle moved like slow brown clouds, and the silence was the kind of silence that two people can share without needing to fill. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in early November, standing in her kitchen garden in the thin winter sun, which was not the most dramatic setting possible, but turned out to be exactly right. He had been helping her cover the root vegetables for the cold, and they were both dirty from the work, and he had turned from what he was doing and found her looking at him with an expression that made every thought in his head go quiet. And he said her name once, just her name, and she said nothing at all. And then he kissed her, and she kissed him back with a completeness that made it clear she had been waiting a reasonable amount of time for exactly that. Nora walked out of the house at that moment with the stated intent of asking about dinner, and walked back into the house immediately, and was heard through the closed door saying to herself that it was about time. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and close, and full of the particular sweetness of a love that had been held back and was now allowed to move freely. They talked about the future with increasing directness. Perry was not a man who, having finally committed himself, was inclined to move slowly toward the practical expression of it. He wanted to marry her. He said so, clearly and without performance, on a January evening when they were sitting by her fire while Nora read a novel in the corner. Anna said she wanted to marry him too. Nora said from behind her novel that it was about time someone said it plainly. They set the date for April, which would give winter time to clear and the roads to dry, and Anna time to write to her mother's family in Missouri, the only family she had left, and give them the news. Her mother's sister, Aunt Clara, wrote back a letter of 3 pages that expressed joy and concern in approximately equal measures, and announced that she and her husband Eben would make the journey to Millhaven for the wedding if it was at all possible, which it apparently was. Perry's mother, Eugenia Redmond, received the news at her home in San Antonio with what Perry described to Anna as controlled explosion. She wrote immediately to say she was coming to meet Anna as soon as she could arrange passage, and Perry wrote back to say please give them a few weeks before descending, and Eugenia wrote back to say she would give them 3 weeks and not 1 day more. Eugenia Redmond arrived in Millhaven on a February afternoon, small and bright-eyed and formidably opinionated, and she took one long look at Anna Lawson and said, to Perry but with her eyes on Anna, "Well, she's exactly what you needed and you clearly took forever about it." Perry said, "Thank you, Mother." Eugenia said, "Don't thank me, I didn't do anything. This young woman did everything by apparently waiting for you to become sensible, which is more patience than I would have had." Anna, to Perry's great relief, laughed. She and Eugenia took to each other with a directness and warmth that was entirely genuine, recognizing in each other a certain quality of self-possessed clarity that both women valued. By the end of Eugenia's 3-day visit, they were corresponding about the garden and the kitchen, and Perry sometimes felt slightly superfluous in his own life, which was not an unpleasant feeling. The winter moved through February into March, and the world began to green at its edges. The Double R was doing well. Perry had plans to expand the herd and a preliminary agreement with a neighboring landowner to lease additional pasture. He talked through these plans with Anna in the evenings, and she contributed to them with practical intelligence, because she had been managing a property on her own for long enough to have strong views about water rights and winter feed, and the relative merits of different cattle breeds for the Texas climate. It occurred to Perry, not for the first time but with increasing clarity, that marrying Anna Lawson was going to improve the Double R's operations significantly. He told her this, and she said that was the least romantic thing he had ever said to her, and he said, entirely seriously, that he meant it as a compliment to her competence, and she said she understood but that he might want to work on the phrasing. He worked on the phrasing. He had been doing better at phrasing generally, had discovered that all the words he had been withholding for 2 years had not gone anywhere, had in fact accumulated considerable pressure, and were now available to him in abundance. He told Anna things he had not told anyone before. He told her about his father, who had worked land in the hill country and died of a heart failure at 52 before he could see what Perry had built. He told her about the 6 years of the Double R's early life, the seasons of no money and bad weather, and the kind of stubborn persistence that is either admirable or idiotic depending on whether it eventually works out. He told her about the loneliness of those years, which he had not let himself fully register while living through them but could now see for what it was. She told him things too. She told him about her father, James Lawson, who had been not only a dry goods merchant but a man who read history and talked to his daughters about it as though their opinions mattered, which had shaped Anna into the kind of woman who expected her opinions to be taken seriously. She told him about Missouri, about the life there before it ended, about the way grief can clean the world down to its fundamentals and show you what actually matters. She told him about the crossing from Missouri to Texas, she and Nora in a hired wagon with everything they owned in boxes behind them, arriving in a place that was larger and drier and more unforgiving than anything she had imagined, and how she had stood on the first night on what would become her property and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement but lived in between them like a challenge she intended to meet. He said he wished he had known her then. She said she was glad he knew her now. March became April, and the wedding preparations moved from abstract plans to specific activities. The church in Millhaven, a plain wooden structure of considerable character, had a new coat of whitewash applied by its deacon. Eugenia Redmond returned from San Antonio bringing fabric for a dress that she and Anna worked on together over 2 weeks of evenings, a project that involved more creative discussion than either of them admitted to Perry. Anna's Aunt Clara and Uncle Eben arrived from Missouri the week before the wedding, Clara small and decisive like Anna, Eben large and quiet, and clearly accustomed to living among decisive women. Nora, who was now 18 and beginning to have her own ideas about her future, served as Anna's attendant and wore a blue dress that Aunt Clara had brought and was extremely pleased about. Cal Marsh stood with Perry as his groomsman, because Cal was the steadiest man Perry knew and steadiness seemed right for the occasion. The morning of the wedding, April 19th, 1885, was clear and cool with a wind coming from the northwest that smelled of new grass. Perry stood in the church in his best clothes, which Eugenia had inspected and approved, and watched the door at the back, and when it opened and Anna came through it on Eben's arm, the world simplified itself entirely. She was wearing the dress she and Eugenia had made, pale cream wool with small pearl buttons, her dark hair down rather than pinned for once, and she was looking straight ahead down the aisle with an expression that was not nervous, not uncertain, but simply fixed on where she was going with the complete intention that she brought to everything. And then she reached the front and looked at Perry, and what he saw in her face was so entirely uncomplicated and open, and his that he had to press his lips together hard for a moment to keep himself from the embarrassment of undoing in front of the entire town. Reverend Macomb was brief and direct, and somehow managed to make the words feel exactly right for the two people standing before him. When he said, "You may kiss your bride," Perry Redmond kissed his wife, and Millhaven, Texas, applauded. They had a dinner at the church hall. Martha Henson and 4 other women of the community had organized it with military precision, and the result was a table that sagged under the weight of contributions: roasted beef and cornbread and beans, and 3 separate pies, and a cake that Eugenia had made from a recipe she said came from her own mother, and was not to be argued with. They ate and talked, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a second one, and there was dancing on the rough plank floor until the oil in the lamps burned low. Perry danced with his wife, and thought he had never in his life done anything right enough to have arrived at exactly this. They moved Anna's belongings to the Double R over the following week. Nora stayed on at the Lawson homestead, which they continued to run as a secondary operation of the Double R family enterprise, because Nora had ambitions for it and was 18 years old and fully capable of managing it with the ranch hand's occasional assistance. She made it clear that she was not interested in being absorbed into her sister's household, which Perry respected entirely, and Anna found both irritating and inevitable. The Double R with Anna in it became a different kind of place. Not worse in its previous form, but better in the new one, the way a thing can be complete in one version and then more complete in another. She reorganized the kitchen and the storerooms with an efficiency that made Perry look at everything he had been doing previously with slightly appalled affection for his own inadequacy. She planted a kitchen garden that outperformed his ranch in ambition, if not in acreage. She and Eugenia, corresponding twice a month, carried on a conversation about the household and the land and the life that Perry was occasionally copied in on, and mostly just benefited from. Spring turned to summer, and the summer of 1885 was gentler than its predecessor, good rain coming through in June, and the grass staying green longer than usual and the cattle putting on weight well. Perry rode his land in the long evenings with a quality of contentment that was new to him, not the absence of trouble, but the presence of something solid enough to absorb trouble without losing its fundamental character. Anna rode with him often, having acquired a sound quarter-horse mare named Pepper who she handled with confident skill. She liked to ride the northern boundary of the Double R, where the land lifted slightly, and you could see for 20 miles in clear weather, the great rolling grass country and the distant blue shimmer of the sky meeting it at a line so faint and far that it suggested infinity. She said once, sitting her horse on that rise in the late afternoon light, that she could not imagine being anywhere else now. He said he was glad she had come. She said she was glad he had eventually gotten into the river. He said, in his defense, that it had been quite dark. She said that was not much of a defense. He said he was aware of that. She laughed, and he watched her laugh against the enormous Texas sky, and felt the thing that he felt every day now, that he had come very close to losing this through simple cowardice, and that the awareness of how close made the actual having of it luminous in a way it might not otherwise have been. In August of 1885, Anna told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, before he went out to work, with the straightforward factuality she brought to important information, but with a quality in her eyes that was not factual at all. He stood in the kitchen for a moment processing what she had said, and then he crossed the room and held her, and she laughed and said she was not fragile, And he said he knew that, and he was not holding her because she was fragile, but because he needed to hold something, and she was the only thing in his life that mattered enough to hold at this particular moment. She said that was good phrasing. He said he was improving. The pregnancy moved through the autumn in good health. Eugenia descended on them in October, which was exactly what happened, and organized everything with tremendous energy and very little request for permission. And Anna received this with a patience that impressed Perry, and that Anna said was simply a matter of choosing battles carefully, and that Eugenia Redmond was worth any inconvenience because she was genuinely wonderful. Nora came down from the Lawson homestead so often that she was essentially living at the Double R by December, which Perry suspected was less about concern for Anna and more about the fact that Millhaven's schoolteacher, a young man named Ethan Wright who had arrived in town that fall, had taken to stopping by the Double R on various pretexts. Nora pretended this was coincidental, and Perry pretended to believe her. The baby arrived in March of 1886, a boy, born at the Double R in a room that had been thoroughly prepared by Eugenia and attended by the doctor from Millhaven and Aunt Clara, who had come out for the occasion. Anna was the kind of woman who endured difficulty by concentrating hard on getting through it rather than discussing it at length, and when it was over and the doctor put the child in Perry's arms, Perry looked at his son for a long moment and then at Anna, who was exhausted and radiant in the particular way of a woman who has done something enormous, and could not find a single word in his entire vocabulary that was adequate to the moment. He found one, eventually. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Just make sure he's not as slow to say things as his father." He laughed, and she laughed, and the baby, who seemed unimpressed by all of this, made a small sound of his own. They named him James, after Anna's father. James Redmond grew with the particular vigor of a child who had been wanted long and loved immediately. He was a good-natured infant, curious about everything, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad shoulders suggested even in babyhood. Perry had not known before James that being a father was going to feel like this, like a new chamber opening in something he had thought was already fully mapped. He thought often, in that first year of James's life, about his own father, who had worked hard land in the hill country and died before seeing what Perry had built. He thought he understood his father better now, the particular investment a man makes in the continued world when he has a child in it, the way the future stops being abstract and becomes a specific place that a specific person you love more than reason is going to have to live in. The Double R continued to grow. In 1887, Perry expanded the herd to 700 head and brought on 2 additional ranch hands, and he and Anna built a second bedroom onto the main house because they were going to need it. The second child arrived that autumn, a girl they named Eugenia after Perry's mother, which produced in the elder Eugenia an expression of controlled emotion that she covered immediately with instructions about the correct wrapping of infants. James, now 18 months old and in full possession of his legs and opinions, regarded his new sister with a diplomatic wariness that slowly resolved into a proprietary interest that manifested as attempting to bring her increasingly inappropriate objects. Perry watched his son carry a perfectly round stone to the baby's cradle with great solemnity, and felt something that was probably the purest form of happiness available to human beings. Nora Lawson married Ethan Wright in the summer of 1887, a wedding at the same Millhaven church where Anna and Perry had married, with some of the same people present, and a general atmosphere of community satisfaction with the outcome. Ethan was a good man, steady and kind, and genuinely interested in Nora's opinions, which was essential because she had a great many of them. They settled at the Lawson homestead, which Nora had been running well enough that the transition to joint management was smooth. The 2 properties, the Double R and what became the Wright-Lawson homestead, operated in practical partnership, sharing resources and labor in the way of families who understand that cooperation is how difficult land gets worked. The injustice of the land speculation attempt by Silas Prout was resolved in 1888, when the territorial court finally ruled on a consolidated case against Prout's operation that had been working its way through the legal system for several years. The ruling clarified and reinforced prior filing rights across several affected properties in the county, and Prout's operation was effectively ended. Anna, hearing the news, said only that it should never have been necessary in the first place, that men like Prout counted on small landowners having less access to the law than large ones, and that the fact the law had corrected itself did not mean the system had worked well. Perry agreed with her entirely and said so. It was a conversation they had more than once in different forms, about the way the frontier's promises were distributed unevenly, about who got to claim land and who did not, and under what circumstances, about the Comanche and other peoples whose relationship to this land predated any of these claims, and who had been displaced by the same system that Perry and Anna benefited from. Perry had been born into a world that treated this displacement as inevitable progress, and he had not examined it as closely as he might have. Anna, who had read more history than most and thought about it more carefully, pushed him toward the examination, and he was grateful for it, and he tried to conduct the Double R's operations with the awareness that the prosperity it represented was built on a complicated foundation that required honest acknowledgement. He could not undo the history. No one could. What he could do was be honest about it and treat every person who worked his land with full dignity and fair compensation, and put his hand to local efforts that moved toward justice where those efforts existed. It was imperfect. Anna never let him mistake imperfect for sufficient. He never let himself mistake acknowledgement for action. The years moved with the rhythm of seasons and cattle and children. In 1889, Anna was expecting again, and Perry watched her manage the Double R through the summer pregnancy with the same organizational precision she brought to everything, adapting what needed adapting and refusing to adapt what didn't. The third child arrived in November, another boy whom they named Thomas, and James, now 3 years old and fully verbal and opinionated, announced that he had wanted another sister and was not particularly interested in adjusting this position. Anna told him that babies did not consult anyone about the matter, and that Thomas had arrived as he was and would be treated accordingly. And James considered this, and then went to look at Thomas more carefully and came back and reported that he supposed Thomas had a reasonable face. Perry said Thomas would be pleased to hear it. James said Perry was being funny, and Perry said he was not trying to be funny. It was a genuine observation, and James said he did not believe Perry, and Perry said fair enough. These exchanges, the small, unremarkable domestic comedies of a family living its life, accumulated in Perry like the kind of wealth that has no quantifiable measure. He had built the Double R with intention and effort, and had wanted to be proud of it. And he was. But the pride he took in the ranch was a different and lesser thing than what he felt walking through his house in the early morning before anyone else was awake, moving quietly so as not to wake the children, going to the kitchen to find Anna already there because she woke before him most mornings, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a look on her face that was the simple face of a person in their own life, at rest in it. And she would look up when he came in, and there would be that small particular thing that happened between them, not dramatic, not performed, just the daily acknowledgement of each other, and he would pour his own coffee and sit down across from her, and they would talk or not talk, and the morning would come through the window and another day would begin. He thought about the crossing sometimes. The dark river, the cold water, the fear that had been larger than any fear he had faced before or after, because the stakes had been not survival in the physical sense but survival of the self, of the possible life, of the future that required his courage to exist. He thought about Tom Braddock's casual remark and what it had set in motion. He thought about the chain of events, the 2 years of silence, the growing certainty of loss, the moment of breaking through it. He thought about what would have happened if he had not gone. He would have heard about the Friday wedding from someone, probably Tom again, and he would have stood in the dust of Main Street with that information, and it would have reorganized his life into a shape he could not quite imagine now. A life without Anna in it, without James and little Eugenia and Thomas, without the morning coffees and the evening rides, and the particular quality of being known by a person who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. He said this to Anna once, not in a maudlin way, but simply because they were talking about it one evening, the children asleep, the house quiet, the lamp burning low. She said, "I would not have married him, you know. I had told myself I would and I meant to, but I don't think I could have done it." He said, "You don't know that." She said, "I know me." He said, "I believe you." She said, "What you should have learned from all of this is that silence is not caution, it's just expensive." He said he had learned that. She said she hoped so. He said, "I have not been silent about anything since October of 1884. She said, "No, you have corrected very thoroughly in the other direction." He said, "Are you saying I talk too much now?" She said, "I'm saying you are making up for lost time and I generally appreciate it." He said, "Generally." She said, "There are moments." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his properly, and they sat like that in the lamplight, and the house around them was full of sleeping children, and the land outside was full of cattle, and the night sky over Millhaven was full of stars, and Perry Redmond thought he was possibly the most fortunate man who had ever sat in a kitchen. The Double R reached its full 1,000-head capacity in 1891, a milestone that Perry marked by taking Anna to San Antonio for 4 days, their first time away from the children, who were left in the extremely capable combined management of Eugenia Redmond Sr. and Nora Wright, both of whom said they were perfectly capable of managing 3 children and did not require instructions. San Antonio was larger and louder than either of them had encountered in some time, and they found themselves occasionally overwhelmed by it, and occasionally delighted by it, and entirely glad to be experiencing it together. They stayed at a hotel on the Central Plaza, the kind of hotel that Anna said she would have considered extraordinary luxury 3 years earlier, and Perry said she deserved entirely. They went to the theater and a concert, and ate at restaurants that served things Perry had no names for, and they walked in the evenings along the river that ran through the city and talked and laughed, and were, for 4 days, just 2 people in a large world with no responsibilities except to each other. On the last evening before their return, Perry took Anna to a jeweler on Commerce Street and replaced the plain gold wedding band she had worn since their wedding with one that had a small setting, 3 diamonds in a row, which he had arranged with Eugenia by letter 2 months prior without Anna knowing. She stood in the jeweler's looking at it on her hand, and then looked at him with an expression that was not the controlled public version of her face, and said nothing at all for a moment. Then she said, "Perry Redmond." He said, "Anna Redmond." She said, "I cannot believe you organized this secretly." He said, "I have a talent for keeping things inside." She gave him a look of magnificent exasperation that meant she was completely happy. They returned to the Double R, and the children ran to them from the porch. James, now 5 and serious about his duties, Eugenia 3 and attached to Perry's leg immediately, Thomas nearly 2, and working on an approach to running that still required occasional negotiation with gravity. Perry looked at his house and his land and his family in the afternoon light and felt, as he had felt on that gray October dawn riding home across the river, that the direction of a life can change completely in a single night, that a river crossed in the dark can lead to everything. The years after 1891 continued to build the life that the Double R and the Wright Lawson homestead together represented. Ethan and Nora had 2 children of their own, a boy named Samuel in 1889 and a girl named Clara in 1892, and the cousins grew up in the particular closeness of children who live on adjacent land and share grandparents and aunts and uncles in the full texture of extended family. Eugenia Redmond visited twice a year from San Antonio, each visit an event of considerable organizational significance, and was the kind of grandmother who taught children things their parents would not have thought to teach them, songs and recipes, and the names of stars and strong opinions about character. James, as he grew, showed his mother's precision of thought and his father's physical confidence, and a humor that was entirely his own, dry and observational, which Perry said he could not account for genetically. Anna said it was entirely Perry's fault, and Perry said he was going to need more information before accepting that claim. Eugenia, the elder daughter, was 7 years old when she told Perry with complete certainty that she intended to be a doctor, which was not a common ambition for a girl in Texas in the 1890s. And Perry said that sounded like a significant project, and what did she need to do to start? And Anna, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, felt something so full and specific in her chest that she had to take a moment with it. Thomas was the quietest of the three, the most inward, the most likely to be found somewhere alone reading or observing the natural world with a patience that exceeded most adults. He was the child who brought injured animals to the house, and the child who asked questions about history, and the child who, at 8 years old, asked his father one evening why the land the Double R stood on had had other people on it before. And Perry sat down with him and answered honestly and at length. And Anna, hearing it from the other room, thought that this was one of the best things she had seen Perry do. The 90s brought their difficulties as they bring difficulties to everyone. There was a bad drought in 1893 that tested the Double R's water management and resulted in significant losses that they worked their way back from over 2 years of careful management. There was a fever in 1895 that went through the county and took the Double R's longest-serving hand, a man named Pete Garrison, who had been with Perry since the early days, and whose loss was mourned genuinely by everyone on the property. There were market downturns and fence disputes, and the ordinary accumulation of practical hardship that frontier life distributed without sentiment. Perry and Anna moved through these difficulties with the advantage of having built something together, which is different from having built something alone and then added another person. The problems arrived as shared problems, and the resources brought to bear on them were the combined resources of two people who had learned to trust each other's judgment completely. Perry did not make significant decisions without Anna's involvement, and Anna did not pretend to consult Perry when she had already decided something, which Perry said was less consultation than notification, and Anna said was a reasonable description of certain situations. They did not agree about everything. No two people with strong views agree about everything, and they had their disagreements, sometimes sharp ones, about how to handle specific problems or what direction to take the ranch in, or how to respond to particular situations. What they had learned, through practice rather than theory, was that disagreement was not the same as division, that two people could hold different views on a specific matter and still be entirely committed to each other, and to the same fundamental direction. The arguments were sometimes loud and sometimes lasted more than one conversation, and always eventually resolved, not because one person surrendered to the other, but because they talked long enough to find the ground they actually shared. James Redmond grew into a young man who carried himself with a combination of his parents' qualities that people in Millhaven found familiar and admirable. He was 18 in 1904 and already working the Double R as a full partner, which Perry formalized by amending the ranch's documentation to reflect the Double R as a Redmond family operation. James received this with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered, and then went out and worked so hard for the next 3 months that Perry told him he was allowed to stop proving the point. Eugenia, who was 16 and the most persistent person in the household by common agreement, was reading every medical text she could find through mail order and corresponding with a woman physician she had read about in a newspaper, conducting a campaign to enter a medical school in the East that was conducted with the strategic patience of a siege. Perry supported this entirely. Anna supported it entirely. Eugenia received this support with the brisk appreciation of someone who had expected it and was glad it was there, but had not planned to stop if it hadn't been. Thomas, 14, was the historian of the family, the keeper of its details, the one who asked his father to tell him again about crossing the river in the dark, because he had heard it many times and he wanted to hear it again. Perry told it to him honestly, including the fear, including the exact quality of the cold water and the dark bank, and the lamplight in the window on the other side. Thomas listened with the careful attention he gave to everything and said, when Perry finished, that it seemed like the most important thing Perry had ever done. Perry said he thought that was probably right. Anna, who was sitting nearby mending and not appearing to listen in the way she sometimes did, said that she agreed with Thomas. Perry looked at her across the room and she looked back at him, and that small thing happened between them that happened every day. The daily choosing, the daily acknowledgement, and Thomas, who was 14 and observant, noticed it and said nothing, storing it away in the place where he kept things that mattered. In 1906, on a cool October morning, Perry Redmond rode the northern boundary of the Double R as he had done thousands of times, and stopped his horse on the rise where the land lifted, and the view extended 20 miles in clear weather, and thought about the 23 years since Anna had come through the gate of the land office in Millhaven, and faced down a lawyer in a suit coat with nothing but a filing date, and her own absolute refusal to yield. He thought about Tom Braddock in the store and the cold river and the lamplight, and the flower on the apron, and the look on her face, when she finally turned around from the closed door. He thought about the first winter, and the kitchen supper, and the fire, and the way everything had shifted in quality, when the thing that had been locked outside was finally let in. He thought about the wedding and the first morning and all the mornings after. He turned his horse and rode back down toward the Double R, toward the house where a lamp was lit even in the daylight because Anna liked light when she was working, toward the smoke from the kitchen chimney, toward the sound of voices, James somewhere near the barn, probably Thomas too. He rode through the Double R's gate and unsaddled his horse in the barn and walked across the yard toward the house. The door opened before he reached it. Anna stood in the doorframe with her hair going gray at the temples now, 48 years old and more herself than anyone he had ever known, and she said, "Coffee is ready and I need your opinion on something." He said, "What kind of something?" she said. "Thomas wants to go east to a college. I think we should let him." He came up the porch steps and kissed her once properly, and she made a sound that was partly protest about standing in the doorway in public and partly not. He said, "I agree about Thomas." She said, "I knew you would. I don't know why I said I needed your opinion." He said, "Because you wanted to tell someone who would be happy about it with you." She looked at him for a moment and then stepped back to let him through the door. The house was warm and the coffee was ready, and through the window the Double R lay in its autumn gold, the grass gone tawny, the sky enormous and clear. 500 miles of it available to the eye from this particular window if you knew how to look. Perry poured his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, and Anna sat across from him and said, "James is thinking about taking on the Garrison parcel when it comes up for sale." He said, "That's a good piece of land." She said, "I thought so too." He said, "Is this another thing you'd already decided before consulting me?" She said, "I hadn't decided, I had concluded." He said, "What's the difference?" She said, "A conclusion is based on evidence. A decision is based on a conclusion." He said, "So I'm the decision." She said, "You're often the last step." He said, "I'm glad to be useful in the process." She smiled, the full one, the one she had never deployed strategically, the one that was just what her face did when something was genuinely good. He had been watching that smile for 23 years and intended to watch it for a great many more. He said, "Anna," she said, "Perry." He said, "I should have said it sooner." She said, "You did though, eventually." He said, "It cost me 2 years." she said. "It cost me 2 years. It cost you one night in a cold river," he said. "I think I paid my fair share." She looked at him across the table with those brown eyes that had been reading him clearly since the moment they met and said, "Yes, I think you did." Outside, James called something to Thomas. A horse moved in the barn. The wind came through the cottonwood trees along the pecan branch and made its old sound, the one that Perry had heard every day of his life on this land and still found worth attending to. The lamp burned. The coffee steamed. The morning opened into the day. And Perry Redmond, who had once been so afraid of losing something that he had nearly lost everything, sat in his kitchen with his wife and his coffee and his life, all three of them warm and real and exactly where they were supposed to be, and felt the deep, unhurried satisfaction of a man who crossed a dark river at the right moment and found on the other side everything that mattered. Eugenia's letters from the East came regularly through the following years, full of the particular energy of a person moving at full speed toward what she had always known she wanted. She completed her medical training in 1912, one of a small number of women to do so, and the letter she wrote home when she received her certification was read aloud at the Double R kitchen table and produced in Eugenia's grandmother, who had traveled to the Double R specifically to be present for the reading, an expression of pride so intense it bordered on incandescent. Thomas went east to his college and came back 3 years later with a head full of history and economics and ideas that he brought home like saddlebags full of material to be sorted through. He and Perry had conversations that lasted until late at night and ranged across everything: the state of the cattle business and the railroads and the changing nature of Texas itself as the frontier period gave way to something newer and more complicated. Thomas eventually settled back at the Double R, becoming its de facto historian and record keeper, a role that proved more practically useful than anyone had initially understood, because a man who knows the full history of a piece of land and its water rights and its agreements is a man who can defend it. James did purchase the Garrison parcel when it came available in 1908, and the Double R expanded to encompass it, and James ran it with the same combination of hard work and careful thinking that had always characterized the Double R under Perry's management. James married a woman named Ruth in 1909, a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county who had her own strong opinions about land management, and who Anna took to immediately, and Perry took to on Anna's recommendation, and then quickly confirmed on his own terms. James and Ruth's first child was a boy named Perry James Redmond, which produced in Perry Redmond Sr. a silence lasting 30 seconds that Anna said was the longest silence he had produced in 25 years, and then a very simple and genuine thank you. The Double R at the turn of the 1910s was a place of sustained life, 3 generations present in it in various configurations. The original stone and timber house that Perry had built in the early days expanded and amended until it held everyone, the land running well managed to the horizons, the cattle representing not just commercial operation, but the ongoing commitment of a family to a particular piece of the earth. Anna Redmond, approaching 60, was not a woman who diminished with age. She sharpened. She lost what had never mattered and kept what had always mattered and added to it the particular authority of someone who has done hard things well over a long time. Perry watched her with the same quality of attention he had brought to watching her since 1883, the specific appreciation of someone who knows what they are looking at. She still occasionally told him he should have said it sooner. It was not a complaint anymore. It was a story. It was the story of how they had come to be what they were, and she told it sometimes to Ruth, and Ruth told James, and James told his son when he was old enough, the story of the bold man who crossed the river in the dark and finally said the thing he should have said years before. The child who was named Perry James thought it was a very good story. It was a very good story. It was all of their story, the Redmonds of the Double R, begun in a land office confrontation and a cold river crossing, and a woman standing in a lamplit doorway with flour on her apron and a question in her eyes, and it ran forward from that night like water finding its level, through seasons and children and grief and joy, and the long ordinary miracle of two people who chose each other once and went on choosing, every morning, every evening. In the cold and the heat and the good years and the difficult ones, in the kitchen and on the land, and in the silence that was no longer the silence of cowardice, but the silence of two people so well understood by each other that words were simply the surface of a thing that ran much deeper. It ran as deep as anything Perry Redmond had ever known, and he had known this land and this sky for 3 decades, and he knew what deep looked like. He knew it looked like Anna across the kitchen table with her coffee and her conclusions. He knew it looked like James and Ruth and their son. He knew it looked like Eugenia's letters full of the precision of healing. He knew it looked like Thomas keeping the record so nothing would be lost. He knew it started with a dark river and a lamp in a window and 3 words that arrived late, but arrived with enough force to rearrange the world. I love you. He had said those 3 words 10,000 times since that October night. He intended to go on saying them. He had learned, finally and completely, the lesson that the river had taught him at its most uncomfortable and most essential. That silence in the face of love is not caution and not wisdom and not patience. It is only silence. And silence, unlike a river crossed in the dark, leads nowhere worth going. The double R ran on. The family ran on. And the love at the center of it, declared late but declared fully, and kept faithfully through all the years that followed, ran on too, steady as the pecan branch through good rain and drought alike, certain as the Texas morning, constant as the stars that Perry's mother had taught his children to name, and that Thomas's careful records would preserve, and that little Perry James would learn from his grandfather one day, out on the rise where the land lifted, and the view extended 20 miles in every direction, which was exactly as far as a man needed to see when he was already exactly where he was supposed to be.